Hello and welcome back to the Transfer Flow podcast. And on today's episode, we discuss Man City's win over Chelsea. Is this the start of a winning run or a false dawn for the champions? Then we go on to the race for the Champions League. Can Bournemouth, Forest, and Newcastle hold off Pep's men and Chelsea and make Europe's premier competition? Then we've got some transfer news. Patrick Dorgu potentially going to Manchester United, and a Norwegian wonder kid interesting City, Arsenal, and Villa. That's all on today's episode. So we're back for another Monday roundup. It's good to see you, Ted. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm glad that it's another Monday in January because it means that we're getting closer to February when the sun might eventually show again.
It does feel like you are in a windowless cell.
I have a beautiful back garden that looks out on this giant valley and occasionally has sun, but the weather's been so horrific the entire weekend that you didn't even want to look outside. You just sort of bundled up with a fire and a book. Or a football match.
And a football match. Yes, exactly. So that's the perfect lead in. We're going to talk about Man City's win over Chelsea first. This game, City threw in Khusanov. They threw in Marmoush straight into the lineup. And it was a pretty... I mean, Khusanov was kind of in the tumble dryer at the beginning of this game, right?
I felt like that was cruel. And it tells you a little bit how desperate they were. And he would have been the stone cold talking point had, I think, Nicholas Jackson decided to use a left foot as opposed to trying to stop the ball and drag it back, and they gone up 2-0. Yeah, he looked completely overwhelmed in the first half. And then in the second half, did they yank him?
He got the yellow card. He got the header back to Edison.
That was horrific. It was so, who taught you that?
And I was just like, in a way, I think it was good. Okay, sorry. I'm getting my thoughts in order. In a way, I think it was good that you still saw the defensive deficiencies of this side with him in the team, because I thought if he came in and things started to look better, then I think people would maybe start to believe that this was just going to right itself far too easily. Fortunately, that didn't happen. City were kind of in big trouble till we got to about 40 minutes. And then they started really generating high quality shots. And they ended up giving up a lot of XG, but they did end up with more than Chelsea. And what was really impressive to me, what stood out to me, I thought, was Haaland's creation. Haaland had 3 chances created and something like 0.5 expected assists. And this was something you were talking about recently, about the way that Haaland can force defenders to come up and cluster around him so he can't get in behind. And then he's actually a decent passer in the open field, and they managed to spring Gvardiol. They got some really interesting breakaway attacks.
So there were a bunch of threads on this. Stones did come on for Khusanov in the 54th. I think Pep was a little worried that he's going to push his luck too much on that one. Gvardiol has been quite interesting in being able to... he gets pushed way up. He's basically a wing back in a lot of circumstances in possession, and he's been super important for City in actually scoring a bunch of their goals. Yeah, he does not feel like... I think Pep has often used inverted fullbacks as midfielders that are able to be passing metronomes. It doesn't feel like he's been using them as almost a Jude Bellingham-like scoring fullback / midfielder. So that's been a continuing theme. The thing that we were talking about a little bit, so Haaland had both sides of the danger factor here. He had a route 1 goal, straight from Ederson, which was always a thing that people had to be afraid of last year, especially, and we saw it happen here again. So he basically shrugs off a defender, but the problem with the shrug off there was if Robert Sanchez had just stayed on his line, that's probably not necessarily a dangerous situation. As it was, a lovely sort of scooped curling goal that puts City up 2-1. And then the other thing that we saw a number of times was the big little game that we said Marmoush would particularly open, because you have a very pacey player that can sort of come in and play off of Haaland. And Marmoush looked as out of place as Khusanov looked in his debut. Marmoush looked completely at home. And so that feels like somebody that is going to continue to make contributions. They pulled him off in the 74th, brought De Bruyne on. De Bruyne, you have to manage his minutes a lot. And then the last goal was Haaland sort of passing to a certainly revived Phil Foden, who, as we also noted over the last couple of weeks, like that's going to be a story to watch because he was almost silent in the first half of the year or first half of the season, and now he's regularly racking up points on the scoreboard.
Yeah, which will help them a lot. If they can get other guys running, then this is something we've been talking about, getting shots from other sources, getting XG from other sources. But in this game, it did kind of feel like this was the perfect opponent. When you watch this match, there were lots of stages where it felt like all 20 outfielders were compressed into a very small vertical space. And all the goals were runs in behind. There were 7 shots worth 0.25 XG or more in this game. And the average XG per shot was like 0.16. And that is absolutely what you saw. You were like, oh my God, just people running in behind constantly. Gvardiol's goal was his third, I think, like decent chance he'd had getting in behind. And Nunes got in behind as well. So it was just, it was the ideal game to have this, to try and do this thing against.
It's two teams that want to play with control that neither one had any control. And that was a persistent sort of circumstance. It felt like Chelsea in particular in the second half, like ceded control. And then they just got overwhelmed a little bit. But the expected goals were like fairly neutral, fairly even, let's say that way, for both sides. Should we flip it around and talk about the other, like the darker blue team? Because it feels like now's like the time. They're in 6th at the moment, tied with Bournemouth, who have the exact same goal difference, down in 7th. How do we characterize this Chelsea performance? And this, let me be honest, like this comes from the lens of people that think the Chelsea squad's quite good, but also people that have been somewhat critical of the usage of the squad, in particular the choice of goalkeeper for almost the entire season. And that is the result of having watched these guys from a pretty decent eye and understanding that they were costing themselves a lot of buildup and putting themselves in trouble regularly due to difficulties building up from the goalkeeper, which then sort of led burdens onto the center back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like, give me your impression first before we like tuck back into that.
Of the whole team? Or I mean, like the Sanchez thing is just ludicrous. Like, you can't afford to give away so many free goals in the Premier League. And when part of the strength of your side is how quickly they're able to go from back to front with Palmer and Jackson, it just seems ludicrous to have to contort yourself in all these ways in order to get through the first line of defense. Not that City are putting up a particularly, stiff defense from the front. Their press is still not really there.
They do know how to press, though, right? And they do know how to
They've heard about it.
They know how to take angles that cause teams trouble, which I think is probably. I mean, I think that Sanchez, like, at this point, has the yips, and deservedly so. Right? If you've put your team in trouble many, many times over the course of the first 20 games, like, you're going to be a little concerned, especially against teams that are even sort of faking the press. And I think the other thing that we noticed even in recent weeks is like sometimes they'll get dispossessed, even from stuff that comes through the middle. Palmer has the ball. Palmer's great on the ball. But if you put him in the middle of a double team and he's having to try and turn, especially not out of a half turn, but with his back to the goal, like, yeah, it puts them in situations that the ball can come back at the goalkeeper real fast on a regular basis, which is what part of the issue is. Yeah, so I look at this team and I think that, they certainly have to make a change of goalkeeper. In this case, Sanchez made more obvious mistakes that were not just in build-up play, not just in the kicking elements, but like, you have a lot of them employed. Why wouldn't you try something else for a bit and see how it works? One of the interesting things that it caused me to think about is like, all right, so how do we create an assessment that tells us like which are the best keepers at being able to pass the ball in the ways that we want to, like in the way, and like how do we have them go through that in training? Because like those are always really valuable things. You build up a lot more information in your training sets than you will in a game set, particularly for goalkeepers that aren't playing regularly. And so now you're like, okay, let's find out like the training assessments. How do we make sure that these guys are doing the things we kind of want them to do from a goalkeeper perspective, not just, blocking the ball, not just being able to do shot stopping, which is really important. But there's a level that it's important for Everton or for, a Burnley that's promoted or a Southampton, like keeping balls out, probably the most important thing. When you're at the Champions League level and you have great players that you just need to get the ball on their feet so that they can do great things, like that is an entirely different set of requirements as a goalkeeper. And they need to find one of those fast.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be that hard. They've got like a whole bunch of them in the clubhouse. Just ask these guys. Like, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about the idea of constructing training in order to get you the data that you need to make this decision in a more informed way. But of course, they can do that. The other part of it, though, is that we quite often with Chelsea still at this stage, we're talking. It's kind of, well, if they want the defense to be better, they have to get a new centre back, and if they want this thing to be better, they have to get a new player in that position. They need a new left winger, and to me, that's kind of an admission of the way that we were feeling earlier in the season, which is Maresca has got this team playing at the level of their talent. Right now, we're not really seeing him add much more to it. That's a little bit my concern with them. I think, why am I not seeing this Sanchez problem solved, whether through personnel or through some kind of coaching change? I'm not really seeing that much difference in them as the season goes on. And it still does feel a little bit like, well, maybe our players are better than their players, and maybe our players will kick the ball in the goal.
Right. And you can't afford that anymore because you have the likes of Bournemouth with a very, very good head coach whose squad is worth, a fraction of what Chelsea's are, sitting literally on top of you in the table. Well, like just below, but then in the exact same spot in the table. And so if you're carrying a 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 coach who also hasn't fixed the set pieces problem, and they brought in an outside expert to help with the set pieces, you got to ask questions. And I think that, part of my column today, and I actually heard from from two owners immediately afterwards who know me. They're like, "Oh my God, I'm still dealing with this." Like, the importance of asking questions in football is incredibly high. And yet people in football say things like, "Oh, well, they just need to learn not to ask questions. They need to learn that that's not their role. They need to learn this. They need to learn that." The reality is, in tech companies, in hedge funds, in anywhere that makes money via information advantages, which is also true for in the gambling industry, you need people who are asked questions. And if you can't answer the questions, then you need to figure out the answers. This is all part of like a good process of getting to new levels of information. And you can be relatively competitive, which, say, 10 years ago, like you had like Mark Hughes as a head coach somewhere. You have like a bunch of scruffy managers that are not particularly good. Now you have among the very best in the world, probably the best 25 coaches in the world exist in the Premier League, right? Like the vast majority of them have concentrated in the place that has the most money. It makes sense, right? And Premier League teams are more willing to get people out of their release clauses, to cut bait when they need to, and fire fast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you've got coaches that are not willing to improve or making clear improvements, that are not willing to ask questions, that are rejecting other people's knowledge, when this is actually an important way to proceed on an absolute scale as opposed to a relative scale, and it's relatively much more competitive than it used to be 10 years ago, then the other teams are going to leave you behind. And we saw that with Man United. So there were two different times that I have had in my career since 2013, commenting publicly on transfers, that basically these transfers are really dumb and they're way overpriced and somebody's going to get in trouble for it eventually. The first time was with Everton. And the Everton people were like, "Oh no, they'll be fine." Like I remember that I called the Gylfi Sigurdsson deal like the Welsh job when I wrote a piece about it in the newspaper. Like this was a heist. They paid way too much. Obviously, you didn't know that other things that we can't talk about because we're in England were going to happen. But nevertheless, it was a nonsensical amount of money that was paid for a transfer. And people were like, "Oh, it's fine." Like Balassi was another guy that they overpaid for. There were an endless series of guys they paid like 30 million for that did not add up to the production that they were looking for. And this was obvious before they made those transfers. And people are like, "Oh, it's fine. Everton have been in the Premier League forever. Like they're never going to get relegated. They can afford to make these sorts of moves, and it's no big deal." That was the first time. The second time was with Manchester United. And what we find is that it does not matter how big your revenue is. You will eventually end up in a hole that you cannot dig yourselves out of simply by throwing more money at it. You have to fucking get smarter. And these teams only get smarter by asking questions. That's the way. Why are we playing Sanchez? And why is Maresca not improving these things? Why? And how do we get better? Like it's a simple set of questions. It may have very difficult, very hard answers, but somebody, and usually multiple somebodies, have to be around these places asking these things. And you can't be offended when someone asks you the questions. You should be thoughtful about it. But that's not how the culture works in most of these places.
Well, and I think also, of course, there's that extra sensitivity, right, of managers feeling like they're going out there taking the heat for all the failures of the club quite often, not just their own. Um, so I can kind of understand on a personal level why a manager just thinks like, "Fuck off, let me do my job." But yeah, you're never going to refine anything if the idea is, well, I just do what I do and you don't ask questions.
Well, I think GMs and directors of football should also be out there in the media somewhat
No, I
regularly.
agree. Yeah.
I think that, actually spreading the burden is helpful.
Hmm.
And you see players come out there and take some press conferences as well. So I think it's useful. And I think that, if I were the type of person that owned a club, like I would encourage this type of behavior. Like obviously you should be good in the media as well. Like that's important. Let's give you some media training, some PR training. But the fact of the matter is, like, you should be going out there and you should sometimes say, yeah, it hasn't quite worked out how we wanted to, or we've had a lot of injuries. I think somebody has done a great job. And unfortunately, like, the squad that we built like hasn't been able to back up the job that they've been doing, blah blah blah. It's like, so you can run some interference, you can make them feel like they have more confidence out in public, even when you're asking questions behind the scenes. And yeah, I think that is also potentially a little bit of a future that you see somewhat in the US sports, not championing them as like way better in everything, but in certain ways, like dealing with the media and spreading that burden, they are
Yeah.
a little bit more advanced.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true. And to bring it back to the Champions League race that we're seeing right now, we've obviously got this cluster of teams. It goes Liverpool, big gap, Arsenal, smaller gap. And then we've got Forest, City, Newcastle, Chelsea, Bournemouth. I'm stopping there. There's like 4 points between these sides. Forest have the worst numbers. City, despite having been on an absolutely horrific run, are fourth. Bournemouth, despite being on an insane heater, are seventh. I mean, it's incredibly tight, and there are so many things that have happened this season that would have confounded expectations. So
I would have pushed back on what you just said.
Okay.
Over the last 6 games, City have 4 wins. Bournemouth only have 3.
Okay, but sure.
But that's the perception, right? Like we've seen
Yeah.
City struggle in ways that they never have before. And now they're starting to come out of it and they're pulling up a little bit and they got some reinforcements. So, and it also tells you how good they were in like the first 9 games or whatever, before like everything went to shit, to allow them to still be in that position. Meanwhile, you've seen everything go to shit for Tottenham and they're in 15th. And
yeah, Bournemouth doing all this, despite an injury crisis of their own, makes it very hard to defend some of the managers of, richer clubs who are complaining about their injury crises, as real as those crises are. It's interesting that, because with Bournemouth, if you'd said pre-season this is where Bournemouth are going to be, then we'd have probably said, well, we assume that everyone's flying, they've probably got some positive variants, nobody's injured, like all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And actually, it's not really the case. They're just really, really, really good.
So the thing you just described is Nottingham Forest.
Yeah.
that's the other team that has that set of characteristics. They're 3 points above them, 4 points above them in the table right now, and have had very, very few injuries, which has allowed them to sort of continue. Though they did manage to lose 5-0 this weekend to Bournemouth.
And that's the thing, Bournemouth, part of what makes us think of Bournemouth as flying is that they've had some tougher games recently, like going away to Newcastle, hosting Bournemouth, hosting Forest, and just stomping them. And Newcastle have been stomping themselves lately, even through quite a cakey run. The defense has been flying. Isak is obviously out of his mind. But you kind of look at Bournemouth and think, please do something in the next week, and you could have a really, really special season here.
Yeah, they're real close. The question is like, how much budget firepower is there? They've done all right on sales, but they also have brought in like a decent number of guys. And yeah, Iraola seems to be like a very talented head coach that we haven't really found his limitations yet. I feel like a lot of coaches in the second season in particular, like when teams have the ability to see more of them play, like they'll start to find some levels of solutions. Iraola's teams do not have easy solutions present so far. Now, it might be that like 1 or 2 teams will figure them out, and then it's easier to play against them in the future. But thus far, they've defied pretty much everybody's possible expectations, and possibly including their own.
Yeah, and then the bigger sides here, like we say, Chelsea, I don't see like massive progress from them. City as well, they've had these wins recently, but they had Ipswich, don't care. Chelsea, who, big team, but I think played into their hands in some ways. And City are about to pass their record for expected goals conceded in a Premier League campaign under Pep. They're just about to tick past last season's total, which was their worst ever. And they've got 14 games of the season left after this one, which is Arsenal away this weekend. I just... You look at a match like this weekend and people always say, oh, well, sometimes with City, these games are the start of a winning run. But I look at them and you think they still aren't pressing, really. They still don't have a DM. They've got this little Uzbek baby boy in defense who might be great, but he's unlikely to be great immediately, right now. And I think there was a time with City where their press was this unsolvable puzzle. It was like this sphinx that would not let you pass. And then it was not as good, but still somehow maintained like an aura of being scary. It was like the Wizard of Oz, where it was like intimidating but kind of bullshit. And now it's just like not there. Now
I think the riddle is, can they rebuild it in the current Premier League? Because I'm not sure that the talent level around them lets them do that. I think that the other teams are so talented, and we've seen this happen a lot actually over time. If you take one of the elite teams, like a Pep's Bayern, or the Barcelonas, like Xavi's Barcelona that was trying to press a bunch, even like Flick's Barcelona now, although I would say that they don't have an elite talent distribution versus the whole of the league, right? I think they have some very, very good players, but they're also like not all peak age, and like they have some scruffiness. If you pack a league with talent, especially pace and talent, and you play that type of pressing style, like you're going to get beat a lot, and you have to have, top 10 in the world center backs or defensive players that can help clean that up. And I'm not sure that disparity is something that can happen with City anymore. Like the money has equalized so much, and the talent distribution has equalized so much that they can't keep it down and keep all the goods to themselves like they used to be able to. So that's the riddle. Now, betting against Pep has been a very, very expensive thing to do for 20 years or so. I'm not sure that I would do so, but I'm certainly intrigued, and I think that the degree of difficulty they are operating on is way bigger than it would have been the last time they did this build.
Yeah, and finding people who can do Pep stuff while also being fast and strong, which they're very, very clearly prioritizing now, having realized that their team has quietly got pretty slow. It's going to be expensive and difficult.
But if somebody has money, it's there. Well, I don't want to move on just yet, because I think that this is really intriguing. Okay. We basically have, let's say 6 teams that are competing for 4 more slots, which is the Champions League ones. I assume that Unai Emery may backdoor into a Europa League slot at some point down in 8th Aston Villa. But so I think we think that Arsenal are pretty safe. As much as the complaining from Arsenal fans for this season has been there, complaining about Arteta in particular. We're not talking about the referee stuff. If you want to see my opinions on the catastrophic refereeing from the weekend, check into the newsletter. I'm sure you'll see a little Chiron come up there to tell you where to find it. So Arsenal are pretty safe, which takes away one of those slots. And then you've got Forest with the worst numbers, but still a 3-point lead at the moment on anybody else, and actually a 4-point on falling out of those slots, because we're assuming the Premier League gets 5 this year. You got Forest, City, who they can't keep teams off of them, but if you have Marmoush and Haaland, who are probably 2 of the best forwards in the league, all of a sudden maybe they don't need to. Newcastle, still very punchy and have taken care of business, have possibly the best center forward in the league this season. Chelsea and Bournemouth, like who's fallen out of that group?
Forest. I've got to say Forest. The points advantage is it's 3/4, but they are like a lot worse than
they don't have the goal difference either.
Yeah, and I mean, like if we were talking about them being a kind of like plus 0.3 xG diff per 90 side up against, plus 0.5, 0.6s, then maybe I'd be a bit more confident, but they're plus 0.12, like in the numbers I've got here, and they're up against like Bournemouth are nearly at like 0.7. Like they're close to Arsenal.
I'm not giving you the numbers that I have access to because like those are useful for gambling purposes, but I think we're a little less punchy on those. They're still very good. So I said a couple weeks ago I thought Forest were like better than a coin flip. Now I think they're like slightly worse than a coin flip, and part of that is just because of the runs that the other teams have been on. I think the most crucial question here is like, so you think Forest has fallen out, but who's the other one that falls out?
Well, Forest might not fall out, but I think fifth is what we're talking about for Forest. I think we're talking fifth to seventh. Okay. I can't not put City in. I think just there's too much talent. They'll work something out. I think. I don't know. And also, they have been on a dreadful run. They've got the best goal difference of these teams, bar Arsenal. You know, I just still think it's possible. Then it gets complicated because I want to put Bournemouth in because of my heart, and I'm quite tempted to put Newcastle in as well. But I do think that obviously they're extremely Isak dependent, and that is not a good thing to be because he is not the fittest guy on earth. You know, in this run of, I think he's got 13 of their 22 goals over this run of 7 wins in 8, which, you know, great, but also not great. And it was quite, I think probably I go City, Chelsea, Bournemouth in the end. I want Newcastle to be in, but I believe that Chelsea just always manage to do it because of their
Arsenal
union with Satan.
City, Chelsea, Bournemouth in.
I don't know, man. Like, look, I don't remember what I said pre-season. I remember saying of Newcastle.
I have no idea.
I remember saying of Newcastle, I wanted to believe, and I kind of, you know, should have believed.
I think Newcastle are definitely the most fragile of the bunch because they have some real stars that are very, very difficult to replace. Yeah. I think Marmoush and Tonali like just make that whole side tick. Also, if they lose Hall, like that's a big deal as well. And then Ishak. So like the benefit is like their starting 11 is top tier. But yeah, they've got to stay healthy. Chelsea don't have to stay healthy, but they got to right the ship. And that 1 win in 6 is Bournemouth, you just don't know, right? And so like Forest, Chelsea, Bournemouth is the tough bit, and then Newcastle's health. I'm glad that I'm not betting on this market. Like I'm happy to bet on the week to week ones because like I think it's really tough, and that's actually brilliant, right? It's brilliant in a way that we haven't seen in quite a long time for like the whole spectrum of stuff. It's slightly unfortunate that Liverpool have gone so far ahead. That would be fine if like there was like just this tail. Maybe they were just 3 points ahead, and then everybody else was looking up and thinking that it was in play. And then you get like the bottom of the league where it's like Leicester, Wolves, Ipswich fighting. 2 of those 3 are probably going down, especially with an Everton win this weekend.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Like the title race, not good. Everything else, like great. I think this is shaping up to be a really fun season, and of course, you know how deep teams are going in the cups, like how the Champions League affects things. Like Chelsea, of course, can just rotate as much as they want, but I think you know Newcastle will, whether they win it or don't, they'll be glad to see the back of the Carabao Cup. I think so that they can just start rolling out their first team when they need to.
I'm always glad to see the back of whatever that cup is called these days.
Yeah, I don't give 2 shits about that cup. But if you know, look, if you want to let us know your predictions for the Champions League places, then you could do it in the comments on our YouTube. That'd be really interesting to see if the wisdom of crowds can figure this one out. Let's move on to Patrick Dorgu, big boy, left back, left wing back, has played some right wing, has been all over the place this season. 20 years old, he plays for Lecce. He's Danish. He
comes out of the talent factory of Nordsjælland.
Oh,
right,
yeah.
Right to Dream Academy. Like they've done great work for a long time, and one of the early groups to really push forward with African talent. They're able to sort of bring them in on student visas and then have them become first team players after a few years in the country.
Mm-hmm. So he's Danish Nigerian, I believe. But he's got over 50 Serie A appearances, which at his age in a league which still often skews quite old, I think is pretty impressive stuff. And Manchester United won him. They're in negotiations at the moment. Supposedly their bid is up to around 30 million euros. Lecce won 40 million euros. What do we think about this?
I think the price probably makes sense. So height wise, 185. And you look at him and he's like a specimen. He looks like an American football player, and kind of like how strong he is, how quick he is. I know that that's a stereotype for black players. That's not what we're doing. We're evaluating his play, because much like Ahmad on one side being really fucking fast and an important cog in this in the way that Amrim wants to play, they need another player on the other side who can do similar sorts of things. I think so. Like physically, you look and you say he has really interesting traits that would allow him to succeed in the Premier League. And Manchester United are another team that absolutely have to get faster. like you look at the dead midfield and then center backs that like are not fit for purpose anymore in this particular league, and you're like, okay, we've just got to get faster all over the pitch, but particularly up top where we're trying to create more free goals, like Ahmad did against Everton and some other teams as well. So I like that element of him. He's a left footer, which also makes him quite valuable. He also has spent time on the other side, which a little bit of versatility value as well. He can, so he's good enough physically that Serie A almost seems easy for him sometimes. Like he doesn't seem like he's challenged by half of the teams there, because they're not a great talent level, and they're particularly not a hyper physical league. And so sometimes he coasts, and he suffers when he coasts, and his team suffer a bit too, because like he'll lose a bit of focus at times. Technically, he can dribble. Technically, he's pretty good in transition. I don't know that he's great, and I'm certainly like I would have concerns that he's very raw for this technical standard that the Premier League wants. But yeah, when you have knock it out of the park physical ability and you're left footer, like, and you're that young, there's a lot to be positive about.
And there's so much value in just having a guy who is able athletically to occupy the zone United need him to occupy. There is this huge space out on the left wing, and it's basically unused because Dalot doesn't really know what to do because he's playing as a left wing back in that zone. It just feels like if you have somebody there who knows where he's meant to be and is capable of running into that position, that will do. This to me is the easiest thing United can do to get better.
It's a
To get
confusing
left wing back.
tactical position for a lot of teams, in that like a 3-5-2 is not that common in most of Northern Europe. Like it's relatively common in the Italian system. We've seen it for a long time. It's somewhat common in Portugal at times, but it's not common across most of the rest of Europe, in the same way that like a lot of teams who had aggressive German pressing managers wanted to have players that came out of academies, or at least squads that pressed aggressively too, so they didn't have to start from zero. So when you're looking for a wing back, it's useful to find players that have played wing back and understand some of the tactical needs and some of the transition needs between those two. I think one of the good things that we've seen in Monday Night Football in recent times is like they'll just point out this player's back here, and they needed to be way up here at this time. Because like they're totally unbalanced. And if he was up here, then they would have like a 3v2 against that back line. But since he was hanging out back here and he had to make a 30-yard run late, then suddenly the chance is gone, and they missed out on that. So I think the Dorgu's really interesting. 30 million. I think United are doing a pretty good job on that price. If it goes to 40 without a lot of clauses, like that's too much, but 30 is like an okay number for somebody that's a little raw, but certainly feels like they can grow into a player that is I would say almost a cornerstone of United's like future play. It doesn't mean that he is right now, though. Like there's a gap between what they need to be a Champions League team and what he currently offers.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And of course, there's also the question of is they're going to pay probably about twice what they can reportedly buy back Alvaro Carreras for from Benfica. Apparently, their buyback there is 18 million. Do you like Dorgu twice as much as you like that guy who's currently playing left wing back for Benfica in the Champions League? I get that's another kind of question as well. What other work do you need to do around the squad? Where else could this money be spent?
¿Por qué no los dos? Is like the question that United have to ask right now, because like Luke Shaw's never coming back to like full health, right? You just have like Luke Shaw is basically a write off, in the same way that they got rid of AWB is like, okay, he's not going to be, ironically, possibly could have been a right wing back at various times. Not quite good enough in the attack, but certainly good enough in covering space defensively during his prime anyway. Yeah, so like they had strong needs all along the left-hand side. It looks like Garnacho's either going now or in the summertime. I think that there are financial reasons for that. I think that they're not excited enough about him. Like they could potentially have a buyback of his as well. I don't know. Like that would lower the cost for Napoli to potentially get that deal done. So yeah, I think that United have to look at a lot of different options and a lot of different ways to build this team. But one thing that they don't lack in is need.
Sure. That's true. Okay, let's go on to our last story of the week then. We wanted to talk about Sverre Nypan. This is the 18-year-old Norwegian kid from Rosenborg. He has multiple proposals from Premier League sides. Fabrizio Romano reported that he went to the City game to watch that. Apparently, there was something from the City group about him maybe joining Girona with a view to going to City later on. Villa are apparently in for him. Arsenal are very keen, according to David Ornstein. They sound the keenest, I guess. And this is a guy who plays as an 8-ish 10, a 10-ish 8. And he has been highly impressive as a kid in Norway. He's a big guy as well, actually. And what do we think? What do we think about this? Price is probably expected to be 10 to 18, or where the rumors are, depending on what's an add-on and what's part of the main clause. I don't know.
Like teenagers from Norway, like when have they ever worked out in
yeah, I know, right?
For those of you who don't remember, there was this kid that started playing like real man football up in Norway at age 15, and people are like, wow, his foot in particular is like the second coming. He's just the most beautiful passer that most people have seen, and he's so good at creating time and space on the ball. And then he was bought by a big club and seemed to like disappear for literally years. Loaned to the Dutch league for a bit, and then judged to be not good enough for the big team that had him, under contract, and then he was shipped out to a lesser big team.
Yeah, it worked out okay for him, right? In the end,
Captain of Arsenal. His
yeah,
name
pretty
was
good.
Martin Odegaard.
Worked out better for him than like Alan Halilovic, who was like Barca's version of that. Remember?
I do remember that.
But like he's 6 feet tall. He's 18. He had, I think, 14 goal involvements in 23/90s last season at age 17, which is hilarious stuff. And when you watch him, it's very easy to dream, right? He's got a really nice burst. He's got great balance. Got a decent way to pass.
Plays in a very weak
all
league.
The time.
He does get fouled all the time, but he plays in a very weak league, and like that's the thing that like you really have to be conscious of. So, is his skill set, which is quite interesting for a midfielder, kind of 8-10, but not like elite defensively. Let's not confuse that. He's much more on the creative side of stuff. Does get fouled a lot. Great on the ball, but you have to say, is his skill set going to translate quickly to a much more physical league? And the answer is no, because his league is very bad. And then you're like trying to watch, Rosenborg against European opponents. You're trying to watch him against international opponents where the teams are considerably better. Norway's been one where like their very best players are ridiculous, like Odegaard and Haaland in particular, but not just them. Like Sanderberg is another one that fits into that squad quite well and seems to be a very capable Premier League player at this point. So yes, you're trying to find, can we find enough comfort level to do this? And again, the question is price, right? So Dorgu, we're looking at 30 million euros. You have this kid who's much younger, but there's a lot more risk involved because you're not playing in Serie A, you're playing in the elite Serie up in Norway. And so then that 10 to 18 plus some clauses probably makes a lot more sense. I think for him, like, Rosenborg know that it's time. He won't lack for offers. People will basically match offers at a reasonable level. And then it's about like what the offer to him looks like. But a little bit like Jack Clark and players like that, like, and Archie Gray probably should not be playing as much time as he is. When you're 18 years old, you just got to be really careful about high expectations because he will probably, not saying guarantee, but he will probably take a couple years to adapt to a bigger, stronger, faster style of play.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, if he were to go, a team like Arsenal obviously have a big draw, and supposedly, Ornstein says he would go into the first team squad, but I don't think Arsenal have been great recently at getting developmental loans for some of their players. It feels like quite often they loan guys out where at the last minute Arteta's like, I'm not going to use this person. I mean, you can argue the loans. I know you've made the point as well that with the loans with Saliba in France went on longer than they should have, when he should have been back playing for the side. So Girona onto Man City later, I mean, that's a real league he'd be going to, but it might seem like at least there's a plan for me to develop here without me just like being chucked into Arsenal squad and people hating me because I'm not at the level.
I think so. First of all, Arsenal have done a good job at playing teenagers, whether by necessity or otherwise. And the teenagers that they are playing do fit in quite well so far. Like even if you have high expectations, so we know that they will do it. I would say that when you buy him, knowing that their age profile of building a squad, right? You've got some 28-year-olds, you've got some players that are a bit older that you got some that are going to cycle off this year, that this summer and next, or might be moved as soon as possible. So there's going to be needs. Just you have to build in a factor that says for 1 or 2 seasons he should go play in Germany or Spain, to get a little bit bigger, a little bit more robust in like how he deals with the physical league, get used to playing a faster tempo, because like that you don't have time. The thing that changes in these best leagues, and this is actually true in Spain as well, you just don't have time on the ball, because players are so big and so fast, they don't give you time. And tactically, like they push forward very quickly. You get more tactical time in Italy until you get towards the sort of like just above the final third, where they often play middle blocks. So yes, buy him now, but expect that it's like a 2-year effort where you need to get him a lot of first team time and a lot of real football time. And then at the point where like your older players have started to cycle off and you've got the slots, you've got somebody there that's ready to play for you.
And I think, these teams can use him in the long term. Like Arsenal, there's clearly a role there. They need more central creativity. Villa as well, right, I think their top player for XA per 90 minutes this season is still Luca Dean, which tells you kind of a lot. I mean, at the same time, these managers are conservative, but it's exciting. It's always exciting that now that the best young players in the world want to come to the Premier League, because there was a point a little while ago, not that long ago, where Kubo and Lee Kang-in and Urgo were all going to Spain.
I mean, the weather's still just much better there. They should go there first. That's my opinion.
Yeah, but I mean, they could just pay for Arsenal instead.
I'd like to go there now.
You can do that, Ted. You're an adult. You're allowed.
That's true. I'm not a teenager anymore.
Let's all go there. Let's have a team retreat.
I'm missing the Patrick, on a sunbed under a canopy photos. Like, we need more of those. The world needs more of those.
I feel like I'm kind of looking like I'm on a sunbed today, though. Weirdly, I'm getting golden hour light through the window. So perhaps that is the time to bring this to a close so I can go and enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening today or for watching us. Please do let us know if there are transfers that you see that you would like us to cover. We're going to be trying out some new talent on the channel as well. And
yes. I wanted to say thank you to everybody who jumped into the volunteer pool. Some people jumped into the pool with no background or portfolio whatsoever. I'm sorry. We're not that pro-am in this podcast. We're a little more pro than am on that side of it. But it's probably a good excuse for some people to start their own podcasts and get some experience, and then volunteer for open positions in the future. But yes, and so we are starting to work through some of those. In some cases, we will invite them on to banter with Patrick in whatever ways they find possible. He's the shredder up there. Ways. He's going to grill the shit out of everybody. It's going to be awful, but yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
That's totally me. Yes, but please speak to me in a work appropriate way, unlike Ted. Ted's allowed, but other people need to work up to it, I'd say. Okay, thank you very much. We'll make sure that you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure that you're subscribed on your favorite podcast app as well. Leave us
tell
a
your
5-star
friends.
review.
Actually
tell your friends.
Yeah.
Or if you win an argument with someone about football and they say, how come you know so much more than me? You could say, well.
Also tell your girlfriends, because we need more female listeners. Girlfriends, wives, spouses, sisters, daughters. Yeah. Like we need more women on the channel. Let's go.
Yeah, like Ukrainian matchmakers. Just tell everyone you meet. and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
That's an
Bye-bye.
Easter egg to watch the to watch the post match. But yeah, so way back in the day, apparently the Premier League was bitching about their footage being on Wisecout. And what's funny is like everybody knows that they need to be able to have video to scout, and everybody uses the scouting platforms in order to be able to scout players. And none of the leagues can ever agree to share things together, and certainly not 200 of them or however many fucking leagues that you can track. And so at some point, the owner of Wisecout sort of fed the problem up the chain to Alex Ferguson, and Fergie in a tirade called the Premier League like, "You leave them the fuck alone. Like, do you understand how important this is for us?"
Cool.
And it's true for like every single team. Like, imagine trying to get players without scouting them, at least on video. And it really hit home during the pandemic when no one could go anywhere. And suddenly you realize that like the data was the second sort of source of lifeblood or flow of lifeblood. But the video is obviously the first one, and you have to have it in order to make the whole sport operate. So I have one quick story that I wanted to include here, because obviously we know I've been dating. It is very irritating to date as like a 48-year-old man in the world, and in fact, like if you're not a woman, because we know that our audience is like 99.8% men, but if you're a woman and you think that it's difficult on your side in order to date, flip it around, like create a profile of even like a relatively attractive man on any sort of dating profile, then do it in your 40s. And you'll just see like this huge gulf of difference in how things operate for the app world. And part of it is because like, part of the business model of the apps is to take men by the balls and squeeze every last dollar out of them, leaving them frustrated and potentially unable to find mates. So as part of this, like I have tried to venture out into the real world and start to do some more interesting things, like, that do not involve dating apps. And occasionally you get like speed dating type things.
Analog dating. You're doing IRL dating.
Which is where I started, my friend, because we did not have fucking smartphones before I got married the last time. Like the iPhone had not debuted.
Mate, I barely did before I met my wife.
It's just wild. So anyway, I'm mentioning this because this is a long story, and you're going to have to include the whole thing because it's a favor to somebody that doesn't even know that I'm doing it for them. But do you know that there's like a Ukrainian diaspora?
Sure.
Right. Because of the war in Russia, like tons of people in Ukraine have left. But not only tons of people, like, the men got called up to fight, leaving all of the women with no one to date. And actually it happened the other side too, but nobody feels bad for the Russian people about that. And so like there's all of these very attractive sort of Central European women or Eastern European women that have no one to date, and in fact have left their country. And I didn't realize this was a problem until I met somebody last year. We started talking about it, and she was she's a Ukrainian influencer that lived in Milan for a long time, and then she realized that like she had so many Ukrainian women that basically had moved out of their country and didn't know how to meet men in other countries. In this case, she speaks like 5 languages, so she was in Milan before and now is in London. And she's built a business out of teaching women sort of where to meet potential mates in London, like, because obviously culturally it can be quite different and uncomfortable. So anyway, she threw a party back in Christmas time. She threw a Christmas party. And basically it was like, a bunch of Ukrainian women and then some men that came to visit. And she's throwing another party, and it's basically a singles party to meet very attractive Ukrainian women. But she doesn't know enough men. She knows like 50,000 women on her Twitter follow, or not her Twitter following, but her Instagram following. And I was like, well, funnily enough, we have just like infinite men who follow us on the podcast. So it is not the cheapest party, but it is kind of fun, and you get some free drinks and you get some food and whatever. So we're going to put a link in the show notes. If you're in London and you're a single man, you might potentially want to go to a singles party. Like, it's down there for you to go. And if not, that's totally fine. I feel very clear of conscience because she doesn't even know I've done this, and she hopefully will appreciate it. And if any of you happen to show up and have a good time, let me know, because I went to the first one. I can't go to the next one because I got my kids that weekend. Otherwise, I would be there.
You're like the piano player in Eyes Wide Shut, So if you turn up and Ted sent you there, then say Fidelio, and you too could meet hot Ukrainian singles in your area.
No, see, that's an entirely different story, and that's like the third. That's like the third installment of my personal newsletter that I've threatened to write for a while. That already has like a list of like 10 installments, and it's called "So I Got Invited to a Sex Party."
Okay.
Yeah, by somebody I went on a second date with.
Well, it's nice to be invited, rather than just to like turn up or buy your way in, I guess,
There are those moments in life where you hear a phrase and you're like, this is the first time I've ever heard this phrase. And I will remember this for the rest of my life because it is very unusual and seemingly like interesting and important. The other main phrase that I remember hearing that was probably significantly more important, but less entertaining for most of you is, "Hi, Ted, it's Billy Beane." And I was like, oh God, I wish I could have recorded that and kept it as like a soundbite for the rest of my life. But it happened like live and I didn't expect it. So there you go.
It's weird that he didn't invite you to the sex party, Like that feels like a that feels like a crossover that could happen. I'm trying to think about a getting on base thing here, but I'm just not sure that I have the mileage.